Welcome to the Ipsos Politics Talk podcast. My name is Keiran.Pedley and Happy New Year. It feels like we are at the business end of this parliament now. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has indicated that there will be an election, or probably will be an election in the second half of this year, although it could be sooner. So there's more urgency on looking at the polling numbers and trying to work out what's going on. And that is what we're going to try and do today. So I'm joined as ever by my colleagues at Ipsos, Cameron.Garrett and Holly.day. Welcome to you both.
Morning, Kieran.
Morning, Kieran.
Let's start at the beginning, I guess, Cameron. So where are we with the numbers? Because I guess to set this up a little bit, there's a constant discussion around will there be a tightening in the polls? Will there be a comeback? Everyone's sort of looking out for signs of that happening. Where are we at the moment?
Well, across the industry, we're seeing the Tory comeback not really happening. Going into the new year, the Labour lead seems to be increasing a little bit. And in the background of that are quite some poor ratings for Rishi Sunak personally. So we've asked this week whether people think Rishi Sunak is doing a good or bad job as Prime Minister. And just 19% say he is doing a good job against a majority, 51% saying bad job. And it's worth noting that basically mirrors Liz Truss's ratings post-mini budget. So when people started losing favour with her, that's where Rishi Sunak is now. And that's when the Conservative Party started to think about changing leader. And obviously we've seen some of that happening this week. So Simon Clarke's failed rebellion, etc. But I think the problem is, where else do we turn now? That's what they're facing. Holly, have you been keeping up to date with that?
Yeah, I think you make a good point, particularly on where else do they turn, because it's not, although there have been some rumblings, it doesn't seem like the many Conservative families had a happy festive period, came back together after a nice restful break. We're seeing people coming out of the woodwork, attempting to support other people. There's not been a lot of momentum thrown behind it so far. It's kind of been drip feeding over the past couple of weeks, so it'd be interesting to see if that carries on. I can't see people rallying around a particular candidate. I mean, at some point they're going to run out of people shortly. They've gone through so many leaders in the past couple of years. And we do actually ask favourability of politicians generally who are not the Prime Minister, and of the other Conservatives behind him. I mean, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak are kind of neck and neck on favourability, beaten only by Nigel Farage, which is an interesting one, with Jeremy Hunt and James Cleverly lagging behind. So I'm not really sure where that leaves them in terms of alternative options. I think we can see clearly from Rishi Sunak, his plan is to stand firm, trust the process, trust him, and play the long game a little bit. But I'm not sure, Kieran, if you think that's a winning strategy.
Yeah, I think the thing on the potential for another Tory leadership contest, the first thing you have to acknowledge is that it doesn't. When it comes to like the absence of an obvious alternative, that does actually matter, because Sunak's critics might say, well, that's not really the point. How people poll right now isn't really the point, because actually a relative unknown with the public, like a Kemi Badenoch, might not be a bad thing for the Conservatives, because it's almost like a clean slate, and she can have a honeymoon and develop into that role. But the problem is, if there is no obvious alternative, what you're likely to see is a genuine Conservative leadership contest, which goes to the Conservative Party members and lasts however long those things tend to last. So this might not be a quick and painless almost installation of somebody else, although that's for the plotters to decide, I suppose. When you look at the bigger picture, I think the uncomfortable truth for the Conservatives is that the rebels do have a point. So Rishi Sunak's net satisfaction rating in December was -48. Liz Truss was on -51 before she was ousted. Boris Johnson was on -45 in July of 22 when he announced he was sort of resigning. Jeremy Corbyn was on -44 as Labour leader in 2019. So there's some unwelcome company, I think, that the Prime Minister is keeping there. The problem for the Conservatives, other than the logistics of how they would make that change at this late stage, is that their problems are bigger than one man. So it might well be that there's somebody who can connect better with voters and that sort of thing. I mean, you could argue that it couldn't be much worse, and that's not supposed to be throwing shade or anything. It's just when you look at those ratings by historical standards, they're bad. But there are sort of political realities the Conservatives face, which is that 78% think public services have got worse in the last 5 years. The cost of living and the economy are big public concerns. The Conservative voters don't trust their own party on immigration, and I think at this stage, someone else coming in and simply saying that they're going to fix those problems is probably not enough. They need to sort of show that they can actually deliver. So it might well be that the Conservatives' best hope is a period of 6 months of sort of quiet delivery, if you like, and that might not be enough. But I think that you shouldn't assume that change is always good.
I saw a great quote this week that said the Conservative Party is usually monarchy that's tempered by regicide, but they're bumped off a bit too. A few too many leaders now. But if they were to try and lead it back, what kind of issues would they be pushing on? Where is this fertile ground? If there's any, what should they be delivering on?
We can see they're attempting to make that thing immigration, and have been for a significant period of time, with the pledge to stop the boats, with the Rwanda bill, with the Illegal Immigration Act. I think, well, according to our issues index, immigration is important to Conservative 2019 voters. And actually in our December issues index, public concern about immigration was showing to be at a 6-year high, 29% seeing it as a concern, third on the list and up 7% on the previous month. So I think they think there's clearly an opportunity there. It is a policy area that they've historically been stronger than Labour on, which is why I think they've chosen it, because it gives them some potentially easier attack lines. It's just the way they've handled it, and we talk constantly about delivery on this podcast. If ultimately people aren't going to see planes take off to Rwanda, he then has not stopped the boats and hasn't fulfilled his pledge. So you can see that's why they're going so hard on it over the past few months. That's obviously caused division within the party, with the rebels a couple of weeks ago at second and third reading. He then did his speech kind of warning the Lords to do what he thinks they should do as the unelected House, which has brought another kind of issue into the mix. But they're not currently polling well on how they're handling boat crossings, on how they're handling the asylum system, on actually getting anything done, which is going to be problematic for them in the end, given, as I said, it's one of his 5 pledges, and they've kind of set the stall out that's definitely going to happen, and it's going to give Labour a pretty easy angle if it ends up not being something that they've delivered in time for the next election, I think.
Yeah, I think we've got to be open-minded a little bit on if both. I mean, one of the things that people don't really engage with on Twitter and so forth, or X is it now, is what happens if the planes do take off. I think that whilst you can argue about how effective a deterrent this policy will be in the long term and how many people would actually be on those flights and so on and so forth, I do think people are underplaying the potential symbolism of if those flights do actually start taking off, because then Rishi Sunak can start saying, well, people said it couldn't be done. I showed grit and determination and got it done, and I'm a doer and you should trust me, and that sort of thing. And again, this is all set in the context of, because the Conservatives almost need an unprecedented shift in public opinion to remain in office after the next election. So we should always remind ourselves of that, but we shouldn't dismiss how things can change. But sorry, Cameron, you were coming in.
No, I do agree with you, and I think that could be a changing point. But at the minute, it feels like they've raised the salience of immigration kind of at their peril. You're seeing kind of they were trying to galvanise 2019 Conservative voters to who immigration is a very important issue, but they kind of don't think the Tory party have the answers, in our polling at least. The public as a whole, 7 in 10 don't trust them to stop migrants crossing the channel. And if this is an issue you're caring about, people have started, it seems, to be looking at Reform UK in some polling. And to what extent are they on the flank there? Pollsters have very different numbers for Reform UK, but YouGov yesterday had their highest Reform UK numbers yet. Other people have them down on single figures, but that is a threat to them. to what extent has this been raised?
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that at all. And I think there's a certain degree to which, when you ask people who have left the Conservative Party who voted for them in 2019, I've seen all the polling like this. What could win you back? They do tend to talk about the votes. So they have made a run for their own back to some extent. I mean, like I've been relatively vocal on this, and people disagree, and that's fine. But I do I feel like Rishi Sunak's personality being what it is, it probably the economy always felt to me like the most likely fertile ground for the Conservatives to eke out a bit of a recovery. When you look at the four key issues, as I've mentioned, Labour have 20-point leads or thereabouts on the NHS and on the cost of living. Labour are slightly ahead on immigration, but in reality, the majority of the public are saying neither party is most trusted. But on the economy, managing the economy generally, it's still neck and neck. Now, that didn't save the Conservatives in 1997, it should be said. But you can imagine an argument where Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt try and say, look, everything feeds back to managing the economy, and we're the best party on it. So if you want more money for the NHS, you need a good economy. If you want the cost of living to come down, you need a good economy. This is kind of the Cameron Osborne line, which worked so well for them. I mean, they always used to link the NHS back to who's best on the economy. The difference now is that the Conservatives have been in power for 14 years, and there's a track record over that time that people will look upon dimly. And I think the other important point, which we shouldn't overlook, is that if you add the Conservatives and Reform together, very crudely in opinion polls, they tend to be somewhere in the region of 30 to 35 points, which obviously means that the rest are not. So I know people have laughed at the Telegraph putting the Reform vote all in the Conservative column, and that's not how voting works. But even if it did, there's still, the Labour, Liberal, Democrat, Green combination is way into like around 6 in 10. So there's a whole other conversation about tactical voting and all this sort of stuff. So I do think the economy could still be the Conservatives' route back, but they're running out of time, obviously.
And I think the problem for them on that is they've traditionally been seen as more competent on the economy, and currently we've got 3/4 of the public saying they think the current state of the British economy is in a poor state. That's been an increasing trend over time. There's also not a lot of trust in the economic long-term plan for Britain. If we're getting back into the era of slogans, because I don't know if I missed that. But yeah, only a quarter have confidence in the Conservative Party's long-term plan under Sunak, and ever since he became Prime Minister, that number has been steadily decreasing. So it's very much going in the wrong direction for him personally and the party. So I think they probably they think they've got an opportunity at the budget to potentially give some people some good news. They need to start changing the narrative to make people feel like they can have a positive impact on their lives. And I think we've said it previously on this podcast, until you could do kind of big scale macroeconomic things, if people don't feel better about the money they've got in their pocket to spend, or their life versus 14 years ago, which is what I think Labour will probably try to remind people of, the economy again is still going to be a tricky issue for them, despite that kind of historic perception of competence and the leads they have over Labour potentially on that issue.
It's worth stressing those numbers there. Sorry. On the good term, long-term economic plan for Britain, 26% are confident. In the days after the mini budget for Truss, it was 25%. That's how bad it is. Like, this is post-mini budget polling on the economy for them.
So let's do a 1 minute roundup then each. I don't know who wants to go first on just what you're looking out for in the next, few weeks in terms of the numbers. Who wants to jump in?
I don't mind going first.
Go on in, Holly.
I mean, obviously we'll have some polling ourselves coming out. Our political monitor will be coming out in the next couple of weeks. I think it'd be interesting to look at voting intention, particularly versus other pollsters, and see what that kind of Tory reform movement's looking like, and whether Labour are maintaining the gap and the lead that we've seen consistently over the past few months. I think also I'm looking ahead to the budget. What is the Chancellor going to offer people that's going to make them feel better about the money that they've got? Because I personally can't see them turning the immigration issue round on the numbers that we've currently got, unless we see some kind of hardcore delivery towards the end of the year. And we're all working towards the assumption that autumn is when that is happening, as we've been told by the Prime Minister. So they're kind of running out of time, and they've got to make a wedge issue stick, and immigration so far hasn't.
Cameron.
I feel like Holly succinctly
To sum up
summarised
politics.
everything we should be looking at. I'm particularly interested to look at in voting intention reform UK numbers and seeing where they move, as I've mentioned. And then in the budget, I'll be very interested for any tax cuts they do, because I think that will neatly tie up to, look, we've been improving the economy and we're rewarding you with some kind of tax cut. But it's whether the public really want that and whether they'd rather have money in public services.
Yeah, and I think all those are good points. I think I would just add very, very briefly that with the budget, absolutely on tax cuts, I think public services is something that we should also be keeping an eye out for as well, both in terms of public opinion on them, but also in terms of any strikes or crises that might happen in various hospital trusts and things of that nature. The NHS can often be a little bit overlooked as a political issue in a strange way, because everyone knows it's important, and everyone knows Labour's always more trusted on it, and then Labour loses. So I think there's a certain sense of, well, that's just the way it is, isn't it? But what I would stress to people is that concern about public services is very, very acute at the moment. I think I said earlier, 78% think they've got worse in the last 5 years. So with the tax cuts framing, the Conservatives have got a challenge there, because they want to improve the cost of living. We know that's important, but people also want to understand they can see their GP and that waiting times are coming down and that sort of thing. So just as Labour have got their own squares to circle, so have the Tories. Anyway, so that's all we've got time for this week's Politics Talk podcast. A big thanks to Cameron Garrett. Big thanks to Cameron Garrett, only worked with him 5 years, and Holly.day for joining me today. We'll have more podcasts in the coming week, including some external guests. So do like, subscribe, share, and watch out for that in the near future.